It began in the winter of 1943, when the world was burning and the Korean peninsula was trapped between empires. Factories in Busan, Seoul, and Pyongyang ran day and night for the Japanese war machine. Coal smoke blackened the harbors, and the sound of hammering metal carried across the city like heartbeat and warning combined. But somewhere inside those same walls, under the name of a repair shop for coastal generators, 3 men were working on something entirely different. To the authorities, it was nothing. A shack with 2 lathes, a pile of broken parts, and a sign written in fading paint. Han Engineering, Electrical Repair. Yet behind a locked door, behind curtains of grease-soaked cloth, they were chasing a vision that had no place in 1943. Han Jae-sung was 27. A mechanic's son who had studied German textbooks smuggled through Shanghai traders, dreamed not of weapons, but of movement. Of machines that didn't need imported fuel, of engines that could outlast the war itself. He called his design Strugal, a word he invented by fusing strength with Kugel, the German for sphere. The idea was daring, a rotary core shaped like a spinning sphere that compressed air and vapor in a continuous cycle, far more efficient than any piston engine Japan possessed. Every night the team worked by lamplight, the air thick with oil and the echo of bombers far away. Old bicycle chains became timing gears. Aircraft scrap turned into body panels. A child's tricycle wheel served as the first test rotor. They took notes on rice paper, labeled in both Hangul and German, hoping the mixture would confuse anyone who found them. By early spring they had a prototype small enough to carry, a box of steel and copper that could run for hours on a single liter of low-grade kerosene. When they first powered it, the noise startled even them. It wasn't the roar of combustion. It was a smooth hum, rising and falling like breath. Neighbors thought they were testing a radio transmitter. In truth, they had built the heart of a new kind of machine. Rumors began to spread among dock workers, whispers of Koreans building an engine that ran without smoke, one that could change the balance of the war. That rumor reached the wrong ears. By June 1943, officers of the Japanese Kempeitai Intelligence Unit were combing Busan for stolen materials, aluminum, bearings, copper wire, all missing. Han's team started hiding their work. The engine was sealed inside a crate marked damaged generator components. The blueprints were burned, except for one corner of the drawing, the curve of the spherical chamber, which Han kept folded inside his shoe. Each night, they moved parts to different sheds, trusting no one, sleeping less. One evening, during an air raid blackout, they rolled their skeletal test car into an empty street. Rain hissed on the cobblestones. They connected wires, primed the tank, and waited. When the engine caught, the car moved forward in silence. Only the slap of water under its tires broke the quiet. For a brief moment under that black sky, 3 men believed they had created freedom. But freedom was fragile. The next morning, military police searched nearby shops. Someone had reported seeing light during curfew. Han dismantled the engine within hours, loading pieces into 2 fishing crates bound for Shanghai. He told his wife he would send word once the parts were safe. She never heard from him again. Records show a coastal cargo vessel, Tatsumaru No. 3, left Busan that week carrying miscellaneous mechanical freight. It never arrived. Some accounts claim it was sunk by an American submarine near Jeju Island. Others suggest it was intercepted by a German U-boat collecting Asian prototypes for research. No wreckage was ever found. Years later, fishermen hauled the corroded metal box from those same waters. Inside were fragments of brass stamped with 3 letters, H.S. 1943. No one knew what they meant. The box disappeared into a local museum storeroom and was forgotten. What survived instead were stories, murmurs passed between engineers after the war. They spoke of an invisible project that predated Hyundai's first factory, of a design too advanced for its time. When questioned, the founders dismissed it as folklore. Yet in one 1960 memo archived quietly in Ulsan, one note stands out in pencil. Revisit spherical compression model, Strugal principle. Coincidence, maybe? Or evidence of a ghost still haunting Korea's industrial rebirth? By the 1980s, as Hyundai engines began to earn respect abroad, older mechanics sometimes mentioned Han's dream, a machine that never needed a master, only motion. They spoke softly, as if naming it might invite trouble even decades later. Was it myth? Or was there truly a prototype lost beneath wartime waves? The trail had gone cold, but fragments, letters, reports, a single blurred photograph found in a retired officer's diary would soon reignite the search. And with that discovery, a much darker story would unfold.
The year was 1945. The war had ended, but the world had not healed. Korea, a peninsula caught between empires, lay in ruins. Cities smoldered from bombings, factories were stripped bare, and infrastructure was a ghost of what it had been. Amid the chaos, survival was not a matter of choice. It was a matter of ingenuity, courage, and endurance. In Busan, near the harbor still scarred by the naval bombardments, a young engineer named Chung Ju-young stared across a landscape of rubble. He had witnessed the occupation, the Japanese factories repurposed to feed a foreign war machine, and the disbanding of local industries. He had seen skilled workers forced to dismantle engines, melt aluminum, and send every useful piece of metal abroad. Yet in the midst of destruction, he saw opportunity. Chung and a handful of colleagues began salvaging what they could. Discarded engines, rusted vehicle parts, broken tools, and even remnants of the lost Strugal prototypes, rumored to have vanished into the sea. Every piece mattered. Every component could be the seed of something new. The problem was clear. There was no blueprint, no support, and no guarantee of success. Factories were scarce, electricity unreliable, and raw materials nearly impossible to obtain. Steel sheets had been taken by occupying forces, copper wiring was gone, and fuel was rationed for the military. They relied on ingenuity, transforming bicycle frames into chassis, repurposing tractor parts, and cannibalizing abandoned cars from the streets. Each vehicle they assembled was a small rebellion against circumstance, a statement that Korea would rise from its ashes. Chung remembered the stories whispered about the Strugal engine, passed down by retired mechanics and engineers who had seen its remnants. While there was no confirmation that the mysterious prototype survived the war, its legend drove their ambition. If the past had envisioned innovation, they would try to reclaim it. The first assembly line in Ulsan was little more than a roofed courtyard, where the floors were dirt and the walls were patched with corrugated metal. They worked from dawn till dusk, often sleeping beside half-finished vehicles to guard against theft or confiscation. Every morning began the same way, scavenging materials from broken trucks, abandoned warehouses, or the black market. Every evening ended the same way, testing engines that sometimes caught fire, wheels collapsing or frames buckling. Despite these failures, they learned, they adapted. Each setback was recorded meticulously. Every broken engine revealed a new lesson. And slowly a vision took shape. A small, robust vehicle capable of transporting goods and people across a fractured, war-torn Korea. It was not yet a car of luxury or prestige. It was a symbol of survival, of Korean ingenuity under oppression. The team faced more than mechanical obstacles. Political tension was constant. The peninsula was divided into spheres of influence, and every shipment of scrap metal or fuel required navigating bribes, threats, and checkpoints. At night, Chung would sit by the harbor, listening to the waves crash against the rusted hulls of sunken ships, and wonder if this dream would ever survive. And yet, They persisted. They built their first operational vehicle in late 1946, a small truck cobbled from salvaged steel and engine parts scavenged from wrecked military vehicles. It was crude, slow, and noisy, but it moved. And movement, in a country paralyzed by war, was everything. This truck became the foundation for what would eventually grow into Hyundai's first series of industrial vehicles. It carried building materials, transported families displaced by the conflict, and even hauled fuel to isolated villages. For Chung and his team, each successful journey was proof that they could build something enduring. But survival was not linear. The Korean War loomed on the horizon, and political upheaval threatened every step they had taken. Factories were again destroyed, machinery looted, and engineers scattered. Yet through it all, Chung maintained the belief that industry could rebuild the nation, that knowledge preserved in hands willing to work could outlast bombs, occupation, and tyranny. By 1949, the first Hyundai-branded vehicle, a heavy-duty truck, rolled off the makeshift assembly floor. It was a culmination of desperation, ingenuity, and relentless labor. But for those who knew its story, it was also a shadow of the Strugal vision, the lost innovation that had inspired a generation of Korean engineers.
By 1950, the landscape of Korea had shifted from ruins to uncertainty. The peninsula was fractured, not just by occupation and war, but by ideology. Factories that had barely survived the Japanese occupation now faced a new enemy: political instability. Supplies were scarce. Coal, steel, and rubber were tightly controlled. Engineers who had survived the previous decade's oppression now had to navigate bureaucratic red tape, bribery, and threats of confiscation. Chung Ju-young and his team knew that every failure could mean the end. One misstep could destroy months of work, or worse, bring ruin to their families. Yet they pressed on, working in hidden garages and abandoned warehouses, assembling vehicles from whatever scraps they could find. Engines from military trucks, wheels from bicycles, and metal sheets from destroyed buildings became the components of what they hoped would become Korea's first industrial fleet. Night after night, the team tested prototypes along deserted coastal roads. Sometimes an engine would seize halfway through a trial run. Sometimes the chassis would buckle under load. Each failure was a lesson, each lesson a step closer to survival. And always the specter of the Strugal engine lingered, a legend passed down from the engineers who remembered Han Jae-sung's creation. While no one had seen it in decades, the principles whispered through design sketches, influencing everything Chung built. The first truck that actually survived repeated journeys became a symbol. It carried not just cargo, but hope. Fuel, food, construction materials, these trucks became lifelines for villages struggling to rebuild. For the engineers, each successful run validated years of toil. And yet the outside world offered no mercy. Political factions, competing industrialists, and the emerging U.S. and Soviet influences watched Korea's nascent industry with suspicion. Factories were sabotaged, shipments intercepted, and supply lines cut. In 1952, the outbreak of the Korean War amplified the stakes. U.S. and UN forces required vehicles for logistics, while North Korean advances threatened to occupy industrial zones. Chung and his engineers were forced to evacuate. Equipment was hidden, partially assembled vehicles buried in mud or shipped in secret. Every decision carried consequences. A single discovery by opposing forces could mean the end. During this time, the team experimented with innovative designs inspired by the Strugal legacy. The concept of a compact, efficient rotary engine lingered in notes, sketches, and memory. While they lacked the original prototype, principles of lightweight construction, low fuel consumption, and resilient design were incorporated into early Hyundai engines. It was an inheritance not of parts, but of ideas, an intellectual blueprint for survival. Despite the chaos, Hyundai's first functional vehicles emerged from this crucible.
They were crude, utilitarian, and built to endure. They were not luxurious or elegant. They were weapons of survival. Each truck, each engine, each welded panel represented a fight against history itself, a refusal to let Korean ingenuity perish under foreign control and wartime devastation. By the late 1950s, a small but determined network of engineers had laid the foundation for industrial continuity. They preserved knowledge, documented techniques, and secretly shared blueprints. These efforts would eventually allow Hyundai to transition from makeshift trucks to passenger vehicles, but in those years, every day was a gamble against scarcity, sabotage, and political turmoil. Chung often reflected on the ghosts of the Strugal engineers, on Han Jae-sung, the disappeared prototype, and the dreams that had vanished into the sea. He would later claim that those shadows had guided every decision, every innovation. And in the blurred photographs, fragments of blueprints, and surviving documents, a hidden lineage of Korean engineering survived, waiting for the moment it could emerge. The struggle was not over. Every road traveled, every shipment delivered, every vehicle built was a defiance of history. Korea's post-war survival, and eventually Hyundai's rise, would be written not in comfort or resources, but in relentless innovation under pressure, forged by fire, scarcity, and ambition. And so, the legend of the Strugal lived on, not as a machine, but as a spirit, embedded in every bolt, every engine, and every vehicle that carried a nation forward.
By the late 1950s, Korea was slowly emerging from the devastation of war. Cities had begun to rebuild, and small industries were restarting under the careful watch of government authorities and foreign advisors. Yet resources remained scarce, and competition for steel, fuel, and labor was fierce. Chung Ju-young and his team had learned to survive in scarcity. They had mastered improvisation, turning scrap metal into functioning vehicles, and lessons from the lost Strugal engine continued to guide design decisions. Efficiency was no longer a convenience, it was a survival strategy. Each engine had to be compact, reliable, and economical. Each truck or prototype had to endure roads that were little more than dirt tracks, littered with rubble from bombed-out cities. In 1957, Hyundai launched its first mass-produced vehicle, a small industrial truck built for domestic logistics. It was modest by global standards, but for Korea, it was revolutionary. For Chung and his team, it was proof that years of struggle, secrecy, and sacrifice were not in vain. But survival alone was not enough. Chung understood that for Hyundai to thrive, the company would need to reach beyond Korea. That meant facing international markets, learning foreign standards, and navigating political obstacles. Exporting vehicles required paperwork, compliance, and technical innovation. For a company that had grown out of hidden workshops and black market parts, the challenge was monumental. It was during this period that the influence of Strugal became almost spiritual. The idea of designing a vehicle that was lightweight, durable, and efficient, core principles derived from Han Jae-sung's mysterious engine, remained embedded in every blueprint. Hyundai engineers often spoke quietly about the legacy principle. Build what endures, not what dazzles. Focus on survival, reliability, and resourcefulness. And through this philosophy, Hyundai began exporting trucks to Asia, the Middle East, and even Africa by the early 1960s. The process was not without struggle. Every shipment had to be meticulously prepared, every component scrutinized to withstand foreign climates, poor roads, and heavy loads. Mistakes could ruin contracts or, worse, damage the reputation of a company still fighting to be recognized internationally. Chang Ju-young personally oversaw tests, often traveling to remote regions to monitor performance, troubleshoot engines, and teach local mechanics how to maintain the vehicles. Even as Hyundai achieved these milestones, whispers of the lost Strugal prototype continued to circulate within the company. Older engineers, many of whom had survived occupation and war, would occasionally recount fragments of blueprints, sketches, or stories of a small, efficient engine built decades before. Though no physical Strugal prototype had ever resurfaced, its principles guided every decision. Lightweight materials, low fuel consumption, and innovative design for extreme conditions. The combination of practical engineering and relentless ambition transformed Hyundai from a company barely surviving post-war conditions into a rising industrial force. By the mid-1960s, they were not just rebuilding Korea, they were shaping a vision of a modern industrial nation. And yet every success was rooted in struggle. For every truck that rolled off the production floor, dozens had failed. For every export, countless obstacles had been overcome. Political hurdles, logistics nightmares, and technical failures. In private company notes from the era, Chung often reflected on the ghosts of those who came before. The engineers of the Japanese occupation, the nameless mechanics who had risked everything, and the lost innovators like Han Jae-sung. These were the unseen architects of Hyundai's philosophy. As the company grew, it carried not just vehicles, but history. Each engine, each chassis, each weld was a testament to survival against impossible odds. The Strugal engine, though lost, had become a legend in spirit. Its efficiency, resilience, and ingenuity woven into Hyundai's DNA. By 1968, Hyundai had established not just domestic production, but an organized system capable of sustained industrial growth. They had survived scarcity, occupation, sabotage, and war. They had survived political upheaval, economic instability, and technological limitations. And they had survived because the lessons of the past, lessons of innovation and darkness, of secrecy, of sheer will, had never been forgotten. It was here, in these early post-war years, that Hyundai transitioned from a company of survival to a company of vision. A vision that would one day extend beyond Korea to a world that had long underestimated the ingenuity born in shadowed workshops.
By the early 1970s, Hyundai had grown from makeshift post-war workshops into a fully operational industrial enterprise. The streets of Ulsan, once scarred by war, now hummed with the sound of assembly lines, welding sparks, and diesel engines. But growth brought new challenges. Domestic demand alone could no longer sustain the company. Hyundai had to reach the international market, or risk stagnation. Chung Ju-young's vision for export vehicles was ambitious. He understood that a truck capable of surviving Korea's rugged terrain might also survive the deserts of the Middle East, the jungles of Southeast Asia, or the arid roads of Africa. He tested engines relentlessly, focusing on endurance, fuel efficiency, and simplicity, a design philosophy directly traceable to the elusive Strugal principles. Compact engines, Minimal moving parts and maximum torque were not just preferences, they were survival strategies encoded from history. Early exports faced skepticism. International buyers questioned the reliability of a company born in post-war ruins. But Hyundai's engineering team, carrying decades of struggle and improvisation, approached testing with obsessive precision. Each vehicle underwent endurance trials far beyond standard requirements. Miles over unpaved roads, extreme temperature fluctuations, and heavy loads. And in private meetings, engineers would whisper about the old sketches of the Strugal engine, comparing ratios and materials. Though the original prototype had been lost to the sea decades earlier, its influence lingered. Designers experimented with rotary concepts and efficient combustion cycles, inspired by Han Jae-sung's Ghost. It was as if the lost engine had never truly disappeared, but instead hid in the DNA of every Hyundai design. In 1975, Hyundai trucks began reaching Middle Eastern markets. The vehicles arrived in containers, untested by most buyers, yet consistently outperformed expectations. Engines survived heat, payloads exceeded promises, and maintenance requirements were minimal. Word of these dependable vehicles spread quietly, building a reputation that would soon allow Hyundai to expand into passenger vehicles. At home, the engineers continued refining designs, borrowing from both survival engineering and modern automotive trends. Fuel efficiency was paramount, materials were scarce, innovation was not a choice but a necessity. Chung often reminded his team, "We are not just building vehicles, we are building survival machines. Every part, every bolt, every engine must endure." During this period, company archives began to reveal more connections to the Strugal legacy. A fragment of a torn blueprint, preserved in the workshop of a retired engineer, showed a small rotary design with efficiency ratios nearly identical to those documented in wartime notes. It was unsigned, but engineers recognized the handwriting, Han Jae-sung. The influence was undeniable. Even decades after its disappearance, Strugal's principles quietly guided Hyundai's growing fleet. By the late 1970s, Hyundai's exports expanded further to Southeast Asia and Europe. Vehicles that once carried building materials across post-war rubble now traversed highways in temperate and tropical climates alike. Chung's relentless drive, combined with decades of improvisation and inherited knowledge, had created not just a company, but a living legacy of survival engineering. Yet the struggle persisted. Every shipment carried risk. Political instability and export regions, fluctuating material costs, and global competition meant that failure could still strike. But Hyundai's engineers had been forged by adversity. Lessons from destroyed factories, stolen engines, and lost prototypes had made them resilient, resourceful, and unflinching. By 1980, Hyundai had not only established an international presence, but had also laid the foundation for passenger vehicles. The company had grown from survival to vision, always carrying the echo of its hidden past. Strugal was no longer a lost engine in a sunken crate. It had become the quiet guide for every design choice, a testament to ingenuity under pressure, a ghost that never truly vanished. The journey from wartime ruins to international recognition was a story of perseverance. Every vehicle, every engine, every exported truck was a reflection of decades of struggle, of engineers who refused to be defeated by circumstance, and of a visionary founder who believed in turning scarcity into opportunity.
The 1980s marked a new era for Hyundai. The world had changed, and so had the rules of industry.
Global competition was no longer just a matter of survival. It was a race of innovation, efficiency, and brand recognition. Chung Ju-young, now older but unyielding, understood that the company could not rest on past triumphs. Survival had transformed into ambition, and ambition demanded precision, consistency, and scale. Hyundai's factories in Ulsan were no longer makeshift workshops. They were modern production facilities filled with assembly lines, robotic cranes, and thousands of workers, all trained to execute tasks with military-like precision. Yet beneath this modern veneer lay the DNA of struggle, the improvisation and ingenuity born from decades of scarcity, war, and lost opportunities. Engineers continued to reference the fragments of struggle principles that had survived through wartime stories, sketches, and cryptic notes. While no prototype existed, the philosophy was clear: designed for resilience, efficiency, and endurance. Every vehicle had to perform under extremes: heat, cold, weight, and neglect. Every bolt mattered, every engine was tested beyond its limits. Hyundai began pushing into new markets: Europe, North America, and the Middle East. Early passenger vehicles faced skepticism. Critics doubted their reliability, questioned the technology, and dismissed a company with a history in trucks as incapable of producing luxury or dependable cars. But Hyundai had been forged in adversity. Years of surviving war, scarcity, and sabotage had taught them a single lesson: failure was temporary if knowledge was preserved. Vehicles were subjected to rigorous testing. Engines inspired by struggle efficiency principles were run for thousands of kilometers under simulated desert heat and freezing winters. Chassis were bent, crushed, and stressed, only to be rebuilt stronger. Every success was measured not in sales, but in endurance. Every vehicle that survived the trials carried a silent tribute to decades of struggle and ingenuity. The influence of the lost struggle engine became a recurring theme within company culture. Meetings often referenced legacy engineering and endurance design, phrases that were never official but whispered in workshops and design rooms. Engineers who had grown up hearing stories from the post-war founders began to see patterns: small rotary engines, efficient energy cycles, and compact designs that echoed principles Han Jae-sung had pioneered decades earlier. By 1990, Hyundai had achieved something extraordinary. It had become a global presence, competing not only on price, but also on reliability. It had survived wars, political instability, and industrial infancy to become a company capable of exporting vehicles to the most demanding markets. And still, the shadow of struggle persisted, not as a physical machine, but as a philosophy. Chung Ju-young often told younger engineers, "Do not forget how we survived. Learn from the past and build for what will endure." It was more than a motto. It was the living memory of a lost engine, of invisible hands guiding each design decision, each improvement, and each risk undertaken. Even as Hyundai transitioned into passenger vehicles, hybrid technologies, and later electric models, that principle remained: efficiency under constraint, durability under stress, and ingenuity in scarcity were values that no market research could teach. They had been learned the hard way, through decades of struggle, trial, and survival. By the late 1990s, Hyundai had fully embraced globalization. Factories in multiple countries, export networks across continents, and vehicles recognized for reliability and endurance bore the hidden imprint of a story few outside the company knew: a secret prototype, a lost engine, and the relentless drive of engineers who had survived war, occupation, and deprivation. It was then that historians,
engineers, and archivists began piecing together the fragments of the struggle story: blurry photographs, torn blueprints, letters, and testimonies from surviving engineers. No single artifact survived intact, but collectively they formed a narrative of perseverance and innovation that paralleled Hyundai's rise. It became clear that the company's modern success was not just in design or market strategy, it was in the DNA of survival and the invisible guidance of a long-lost idea. And so Hyundai's struggle had evolved. From war-torn workshops to international assembly lines, the principles of endurance, efficiency, and ingenuity persisted. Struggle was gone, yet everywhere it had touched, it had left traces, silent, subtle, but undeniable. The legacy of a prototype lost to history had become the foundation of one of the most resilient industrial empires of the modern era.
As the 21st century approached, Hyundai had transformed from a survival-driven workshop into a global industrial powerhouse. But beneath the glossy factories, sophisticated assembly lines, and modern vehicle designs, the story of struggle remained alive, embedded in culture, philosophy, and engineering principles. Engineers in Ulsan, even decades later, would tell stories of scavenging scrap, rebuilding engines in secret, and the whispered legend of the struggle prototype. Though no one had seen it, its philosophy guided their work. Build for endurance, for efficiency, for adaptability. Every vehicle, every motor, every component bore the invisible imprint of survival engineering, a mindset forged during war, scarcity, and political upheaval. Chung Ju-young, now elder statesman of Korean industry, reflected often on the journey. He would recount how early experiments, burned engines, improvised chassis, midnight assembly lines taught lessons that no textbook could convey. Lessons of resourcefulness, resilience, and relentless problem-solving. Lessons that unknowingly had originated decades earlier in a hidden workshop with a man named Han Jae-sung and his mysterious struggle engine. Hyundai's expansion into global markets in the 1990s and early 2000s reflected these enduring principles. Reliability tests, extreme condition trials, and engineering rigor were not merely corporate policies. They were survival instincts inherited from decades of struggle. Even as Hyundai embraced luxury vehicles, electric models, and cutting-edge hybrid systems, the guiding ethos remained the same: efficiency, durability, and intelligence under constraint. Historians tracing the company's origins discovered fragments, blurred photographs, partially scorched blueprints, letters, and testimony from surviving engineers. They pieced together a narrative that was as much about human perseverance as it was about technology. The struggle engine, lost to the tides of war, had left no physical trace, but its influence permeated every design choice. From early industrial trucks to modern passenger vehicles, the same principles persisted: minimal friction, compact energy systems, and reliability beyond expectation. In interviews, Hyundai engineers often reflected on a phrase passed down from early post-war leaders: "Do not build for now, build for endurance." This phrase, though never official, echoed the philosophy of struggle. It symbolized a continuum, from wartime improvisation to industrial innovation, from hidden workshops to global assembly lines. It was proof that the spirit of ingenuity can outlive the physical artifacts it inspires. By the 2010s, Hyundai had become a symbol of South Korea's transformation, a nation rising from war-torn ruins to global industrial prominence. Yet behind this success story lay a deeper narrative, one of struggle, secrecy, lost prototypes, and the relentless will of engineers who refused to let circumstance define them.
The Strugal engine remained a myth to most, but to those who understood its story, it was a guiding force, a reminder that even lost ideas can shape generations. From Han Jae-sung's hidden workshop to Chung Ju-young's post-war endeavors to the sprawling global factories of modern Korea, the spirit of resilience endured. And as Hyundai continues to innovate, electric propulsion, autonomous systems, and sustainable designs, the lessons of struggle remain embedded in every vehicle. Efficiency is not just a measure of fuel, it is a measure of survival. Durability is not just engineering, it is legacy. Ingenuity is not just invention, it is a tribute to those who built in darkness, with nothing but vision, courage, and determination.
The search for Strugal had spanned decades, continents, and generations. What began as whispers of a lost prototype in a bombed-out workshop had grown into a narrative of perseverance, ingenuity, and survival. Though the engine itself remained lost, perhaps forever, it had left traces that shaped an entire company, an entire nation, and eventually a global industry. Hyundai, now a worldwide automotive powerhouse, carried within its DNA the lessons of scarcity, innovation, and resilience. Every hybrid engine, every fuel-efficient truck, every electric model bore the subtle fingerprints of the Strugal philosophy: efficiency, endurance, and intelligent simplicity. It was a silent mentorship from a machine that never existed in its complete form, proof that ideas could survive when metal and bolts could not. Historians, engineers, and archivists pieced together the fragments, creating exhibitions that celebrated not just vehicles, but human ingenuity under pressure. Blurry photographs of early workshops, yellowed sketches, and salvaged engine fragments reminded the world that the journey of Hyundai was inseparable from the struggle of its founders. Chung Ju-young's post-war vision, guided unknowingly by the lost Strugal engine, had transformed the company from survival to global innovation. Modern engineers at Hyundai often speak of Strugal in quiet reverence, not as a technical manual, but as a philosophy. Design for endurance, optimize for scarcity, innovate under constraint. It is a mindset passed from the hidden workshops of the 1940s to the sprawling high-tech laboratories of the 21st century. And it continues to guide every decision, every design, and every vehicle. The story of Strugal is also a story of Korea itself. From the ruins of war to industrial prominence, the nation's resilience mirrored the philosophy of its engineers. The ingenuity of a few men in makeshift workshops became the engine of a country's industrial rebirth. The lost Strugal engine, though absent physically, became a symbol of a nation's drive, a testament to the power of innovation and perseverance. As Hyundai pushes further into the future, autonomous systems, sustainable energy vehicles, global expansion, the spirit of Strugal remains embedded in every initiative. It is a reminder that true innovation is not only about resources, technology, or markets, but about vision, courage, and the relentless pursuit of possibility, even in the face of overwhelming odds. And so the Strugal engine, once lost to history, lives on, in the engines that roar across highways and deserts, in the research labs where engineers push boundaries, in the story of a company that refused to be defeated by circumstance. The documentary concludes not with the discovery of the physical artifact, but with the acknowledgement that some legacies endure in principle, in spirit, and in every challenge overcome. Hyundai's rise from post-war struggle to global innovation is a living tribute to Strugal, a ghost engine that never was, yet always is.